Michael's eyes remained locked on her, the scene unfolding before him as though it were a moment pulled from a dream. The noise of the street faded into an almost unbearable silence. The city that thrived on chaos seemed to pause, giving way to the vulnerable stillness that surrounded Mary. Her stomach, swollen with the life she carried, was a stark contrast to the empty space that Michael felt within himself. She was small, thin. Her torn clothes clung to her body like a second skin, the dirt on her face barely masking the quiet strength in her eyes. There was no begging in her posture, no pleading in her voice. She didn't ask for sympathy, for charity, or for pity. She merely existed, just like the city she was a part of, silently enduring. A sharp pang of guilt cut through Michael as he observed her. His mind raced. He could offer her something, money, a meal, a shelter, but none of those things would answer the unspoken question in his chest. Why was she here? How had she ended up on the side of the road, a pregnant woman in the heart of the bustling metropolis? Why had he been given so much, while she had so little? The faint odor of rotting fruit grew stronger, mixing with the cloying stench of human sweat and poverty. It hit him like a weight, forcing him to acknowledge the disparity between his world and hers, between his life of polished glass and her existence on the street. His hand tightened around the briefcase in his grasp, the leather pressing against his palm as though the weight of his wealth was suddenly too much to bear. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no recognition, no joy in the glance, just a quiet understanding that they shared a fleeting, silent connection. But that brief exchange, that unspoken communication, hit Michael harder than any corporate deal or financial triumph ever had. In that instant, he realized how empty his accomplishments had left him. He had conquered the world of business, but the world of people, of real, human connection, had eluded him. He could hear his assistant's voice in his head, reminding him of the time. His meeting was looming, and he had no more time to spare. He was the one who walked away. He always did, didn't he? That was the story of his life. People came and went, but the business stayed. And the business never asked questions. It never demanded more than what he was willing to give. Yet, as Michael turned his back and began to walk toward his car, a voice inside him, soft but unmistakable, whispered, "Maybe you're walking away from something you should have stayed for." But the thought was fleeting. The weight of the world, of his obligations, of his success, pressed too hard for him to turn back. He kept walking, his footsteps growing louder in the silence that followed. Before now, Michael's life was not always this way. There had been no suits, no office buildings towering over his head. There had only been the cramped space of their small home in the heart of Lagos, where the walls seemed to close in with every passing day. The house was always damp, the roof leaking in the rainy season, and the nights were colder than the ones he'd later experience in the penthouses of luxury. Yet it was home. It was the only place that mattered because there, in that dimly lit, overcrowded room, he had his mother, Ruth. Ruth worked tirelessly. She would wake up before the first rays of light hit the city, putting on her worn apron, the fabric thinning with years of use, and set to work. Her hands were a map of hard work, blisters, calluses, and rough edges. She worked as a street vendor, selling akra and bread to the people in the neighborhood. The stoves she used were old, rusted from years of use. And yet, she always managed to make something from nothing, always managing to put food on the table. But it was more than just survival for Ruth. It was about teaching Michael that there was more to life than this struggle. She had dreams for him, dreams that her hands couldn't build, but that she hoped he could achieve. You can be more than this, Michael. You don't have to stay here forever. You have a gift. Don't waste it. Her words, though simple, became his mantra. They kept him going even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. Michael often recalled his school days. The thick, tattered school bag he'd carried for years, the one that never seemed to zip properly. His uniform, always faded, the collar fraying at the edges, was a stark reminder that his life was different from the other kids. It wasn't the richness of his classmates that stung the most, but the way they looked at him. He could hear their laughter, feel their eyes as they judged him. But it wasn't just their laughter that haunted him, it was the feeling that he was always falling short, always chasing something he couldn't quite grasp. He remembered the way his classmates' shoes shone with polish, how their bags were brand new, and how his were worn down with each passing year. The shame of having to ask his mother for money for a lunch he couldn't afford, the days when he had to carry an empty stomach through the halls. But he never complained. His mother taught him not to complain. Never let the world see your weakness, Michael. Stand tall even when you feel small. And he did. It was that unshakable belief in something better that kept him awake at night. Every time he felt the sting of rejection or the weight of his poverty, his mother's voice would echo in his head, urging him to keep moving forward. You can be more than this, Michael. You have to believe that. He did believe it, somehow. There were nights when he would sit up late, studying by the dim light of a broken lamp, trying to teach himself the things his classmates knew. He spent hours at the library, learning finance, a subject he had once thought was too difficult for someone like him. He studied hard, absorbing every word, every number, every principle. He worked nights at a local restaurant, washing dishes, running errands, anything to get closer to his dream. He could feel the weight of his mother's sacrifice pressing down on him. Every hour he spent working, every penny he saved, every page he turned in his textbooks, was for her. His breakthrough came when he was accepted to a scholarship program. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. He took it, knowing that he was not just building a future for himself, but honoring the dream his mother had carried for him. The days of scraping by, of living in the shadow of poverty, were coming to an end. But Ruth didn't live long enough to see him succeed. She passed away when he was just 23. Her final breath came quietly, peacefully, after one final night of selling her accra on the streets. Michael sat beside her bed in the small room they had shared, his heart heavy with the weight of a loss that he couldn't quite comprehend. The funeral was small, just a few friends and family who showed up to mourn a woman who had given everything for her son. There was no grand gesture, no endless stream of visitors, just Michael, standing by her grave, his heart filled with gratitude and grief all at once. She had given him life, love, and a chance at something better, but in the end, she had nothing left for herself. Her death left him with an emptiness he hadn't expected, a hollowness that wealth and success could never fill. Yet, the memories of Ruth's strength, her unshakable belief in him, lived on. They were what kept him moving forward. They were the reason he had climbed to the heights he now stood at. But in the quiet moments, when the noise of his success faded away, the ache of losing her lingered. The world was now his, but it felt empty without her in it. He had made it. He was a millionaire now, his name known in every boardroom and every office building across the city. But in the stillness of his heart, he often wondered, was all of this really enough? Had he won the battle, only to lose something more important along the way? It was a Sunday afternoon at St. Gabriel's Church in Lagos when Michael first saw her. The old church, with its cracked walls and faded paint, seemed like it had stood for centuries, worn down by time and the heavy footsteps of the city's inhabitants. The smell of incense hung in the air, mingling with the sound of distant chanting and the soft hum of the organ that filled the cavernous space. Michael had been coming to church on and off for years, mostly because it had been a way to keep his mother's memory alive. Ruth had always insisted on attending service every Sunday, and although Michael's faith had waned over the years, he still came. It was part of the ritual of keeping her close. But today, something in the air felt different. There was a stillness, a quiet that seemed to pulse through the walls of the church, a sacredness that cut through the noise of Lagos just outside. He found a seat near the front, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone floor, and for the first time in a long while, he felt out of place, like a stranger in a space that should have offered him solace. His eyes scanned the congregation, settling on the back pews. That's when he saw her, Mary. She sat near the back of the church, her presence almost unnoticed among the congregation. She held a worn hymn book in her hands, the edges of the pages frayed from years of use. Her clothes were modest, though tattered in places, as if they had seen too many hardships. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, but it was the quiet dignity in her face that caught his attention. She seemed entirely out of place here, a woman with no shoes, no status, no wealth, yet there was a quiet strength in her that spoke to something deeper. As their eyes met for a fleeting second, Michael felt something stir within him. It wasn't a feeling of attraction, not in the traditional sense, but a connection that he couldn't put into words. Her eyes were dark and deep, and there was a sadness there, a story etched in her gaze that he couldn't understand, but somehow, it resonated within him. His heart quickened. What could she possibly want with a man like me? Michael thought. He had everything, wealth, status, the trappings of success, but none of it felt real when he looked at her. It was as though the life he had built for himself, his suits, his office, his achievements, was just a facade, a veil over something that was so much more meaningful and authentic. He, who had everything, felt hollow compared to the quiet power she exuded. What did it all mean when someone like her existed, someone so far removed from the world he inhabited, yet with a strength he could never quite reach? Before he could allow himself to examine the thought further, she looked away, her eyes lowering back to the faded hymn book in her hands. Her fingers, delicate but worn, trembled slightly as she turned the pages. Michael couldn't help but notice how fragile she appeared, yet there was a quiet grace in the way she moved, in the way she held herself with such restraint. He watched her for a long moment, until the sound of the congregation's murmurs brought him back to reality. But then she did something that took him by surprise. She offered him a small smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that smile there was something powerful, a recognition, perhaps, of their shared humanity. It was as if she had seen something in him, something he wasn't even aware of himself. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a gesture of kindness that carried with it an unspoken message. I see you. Michael's breath caught in his chest, the smile lingering in his mind long after she had looked away. What did it mean? Why did he feel so drawn to her? His thoughts raced. He had done nothing, said nothing, and yet, there was a shift inside him. He felt his heart quicken, his pulse thumping in his ears. He felt like a man at a crossroads, though he didn't know which path to take. After the service ended, Michael found himself standing outside the church, the sound of the congregation fading into the busy hum of the street. The bright Lagos sun beat down on him, but there was a coolness in the air, a freshness that mirrored the way he felt inside. His mind kept returning to Mary. There was something about her, a quiet grace, a dignity in her poverty, an authenticity that he didn't recognize in his own life. He didn't know her story, but he knew deep down that it was one of struggle, one that mirrored his own in some ways. Yet she seemed to carry her pain without asking for anything in return. He tried to shake the thought. After all, what could he possibly do for her? His life was complicated enough, tangled in the web of his own wealth and status. The people in his world, people like him, didn't look twice at someone like Mary. They walked past her. They ignored her. They dismissed her. But as Michael walked away, a thought lingered, haunting him as it had so many times before. What if I could do something more? The thought settled heavily in his chest, and though he tried to push it away, it kept returning, tugging at him like a pull he couldn't explain. He had been given everything: money, fame, recognition, and yet, when he looked at Mary, he felt like he had nothing at all. She had nothing, and yet, somehow, she seemed to have everything. He had done nothing, but something had shifted in him that day. Mary's quiet presence, her dignity in the face of hardship, had awakened something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a desire for true connection, for something real. The thought of her stayed with him as he walked the streets of Lagos, a city that now seemed like a maze of noise and distractions. He had no answers, no clarity, but something inside him had irrevocably changed. The path ahead was unclear, but Michael knew one thing for sure: he couldn't just walk away from her. Not this time. Their encounters became more frequent, each one seemingly unimportant yet profoundly significant. Michael found himself passing by the same street corner every few days, and each time, Mary was there. She sat in the same place, her rounded belly unmistakable, her eyes fixed on the ground or scanning the passers-by with a quiet resilience. He didn't seek her out. He didn't have to. Somehow, he knew he'd find her there, waiting in the chaotic rhythms of Lagos. The encounters were never grand. They didn't need to be. Just small moments, brief exchanges, a simple, "How are you?" or "I'll pray for you," spoken in a tone that was quieter than the world around them, and yet somehow louder than anything Michael had ever experienced. She never asked for anything. No money, no help, no pity. She only wanted to be seen, and in return, she offered Michael something he had not realized he had been yearning for, a genuine, honest connection. Every time their eyes met, every time their brief conversations ended, Michael felt his world growing smaller, more intimate, more personal, more real. In his world of constant noise, deadlines, and expectations, Mary became the only thing that grounded him. She didn't need his wealth, his influence, or even his sympathy. She simply needed someone to notice her, to acknowledge that she existed. One afternoon, Michael walked by with a bag of food he had just bought for himself. Without thinking, he paused. It was a small gesture. He offered her half of his meal, a warm sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She looked at him for a moment, surprised, then accepted it with a quiet smile, her eyes showing gratitude but no sense of entitlement. It was so simple, yet it made his heart tighten in a way he hadn't expected. In the days that followed, Michael felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. Mary didn't ask for more, but she didn't pull away either. One day, he returned with a few hundred naira, money that could mean a lot to someone living on the streets. She didn't hesitate. She took it from him, nodding in acknowledgement, but again, she didn't ask for anything beyond that. Her acceptance was more humbling than anything Michael had ever experienced. It was during one of these fleeting moments that Michael found himself daring to ask something he never thought he would. "Mary, would you like to have lunch with me? Just to talk?" The question seemed out of place. It didn't belong in the world he had built for himself. A lunch invitation seemed absurd. He, a millionaire, offering lunch to a pregnant beggar, but somehow, it felt right too. His heart raced as he waited for her response. Mary hesitated. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He saw the world in her gaze, the world that had been unkind to her, that had torn her down when she was most vulnerable. And yet, after a moment of quiet reflection, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. They sat together at a small, roadside restaurant. It wasn't much, plastic chairs and peeling paint, the smell of fried food mixing with the exhaust fumes from the street, but to Michael, it felt like the most important meal of his life. Over a simple plate of rice and beans, Mary spoke of her life, not in a way that demanded sympathy, but with the quiet grace that he had come to admire. She told him of the years she had spent working as a cleaner in an office building nearby, scrubbing floors and cleaning windows to make ends meet. She wasn't always on the streets. She had once had a job, a place of her own. But when she found out she was pregnant, her world came crashing down. The office fired her, leaving her with no income and no options. The father of her child had disappeared as soon as he knew she was pregnant, leaving her to navigate the streets alone. Her voice faltered as she spoke of the day she was left with nothing but her own will to survive. The tears she fought back were hidden beneath the calm exterior she had cultivated, but Michael could see them. He could hear the pain in her voice, the way the weight of her circumstances had shaped her, and it struck him harder than he could have anticipated. But even in the face of all this, there was a softness to Mary, a quiet strength. She didn't see herself as a victim. She wasn't asking for anyone to feel sorry for her. She simply wanted to survive, to live with dignity, no matter the hand she had been dealt. And that dignity, it was something Michael had never encountered in his world of high stakes, ruthless ambition, and empty accolades. As they finished their meal, Michael felt something shift within him. He had spent years building a life based on success, on wealth, on accumulating things. But sitting across from Mary, he realized just how shallow all of it seemed. She had nothing, yet she had everything. She had a spirit that couldn't be broken, a soul that wasn't defined by the hardship of her life. In the days that followed, Michael found himself caught between two worlds. There was the world of wealth, power, and prestige that he had cultivated for years, and then there was Mary, someone whose life had been a constant struggle, yet whose heart was more full of life than his had ever been. The contrast was striking, and the deeper he got to know her, the more he realized how empty his own life had been. Ruth, a trusted old friend who had been with him through all his trials, had seen this change in him. Ruth, a woman whose wisdom he respected, had always been there to offer a steady hand when his life felt like it was spiraling out of control. And it was Ruth who now cautioned him, her voice steady with concern. "Michael," she said one evening as they sat in the quiet of his home, "gold that shines too bright can burn your hand." Her words struck him with the force of a slap. Was he being foolish? Was he letting his own desires blind him to the dangers of getting too close to someone like Mary? Could a man like him, someone with so much to lose, afford to get involved with someone so far removed from his world? But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Mary was the answer he had been searching for. Despite Ruth's warning, he knew that something about her was real, something he had never experienced before. The question that lingered in his mind was not whether he should be with her, but whether he could reconcile the man he had become with the man he wanted to be. For the first time in his life, Michael realized that the wealth and success he had fought so hard for were not what mattered most. It was connection. It was seeing others, not as charity cases, not as projects to be fixed, but as human beings worthy of respect and love. And for the first time, he knew that Mary had the power to change everything. The moment Michael's engagement to Mary became public, the world around him shifted. It was as if a dark cloud had descended over his carefully curated life, shrouding the gleaming towers of his success with doubt and suspicion. At first, it was subtle, the occasional raised eyebrow in the office, the whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room. But as the weeks passed and the news of his engagement spread through Lagos, the whispers grew louder, sharper, and more venomous. His business competitors were quick to pounce. They saw his union with Mary as a threat, something to ridicule, something to undermine. A millionaire with a beggar? They whispered behind closed doors, their voices laced with disdain. What will the world say about that? They tried to use it against him, calling him weak, naive, even foolish. His colleagues who had once respected him now looked at him with pity, as if he had somehow betrayed his own success, his own ambition. The pressure was immense. Every day, Michael found himself fighting against a rising tide of judgment. His reputation, once built on hard work, sharp decisions, and unrelenting focus, now felt fragile, vulnerable to the opinions of others. He had everything, and yet they made him feel like he had nothing. The isolation was suffocating. He could feel the weight of their disapproval on his shoulders, pulling him down. His world, once solid and defined, was now shifting beneath him, and he had no idea how to steady himself. But nothing prepared him for the moment that shattered everything. It was late one evening. Michael was in his office, reviewing contracts and going over some figures, when he overheard a conversation in the hallway. The voices were muffled, but one was unmistakable. It was Toby, his closest friend, the one person who had been with him through thick and thin, the man he had trusted more than anyone else in the world. "What is he thinking?" Toby's voice was sharp, laden with disgust. "Stooping so low, marrying a beggar? A pregnant woman from the streets? He's ruining his career, his reputation. Does he really think he can walk around with her and still be taken seriously?" The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He wanted to believe he had misunderstood, that the words hadn't come from Toby's mouth. But they had. He could hear them now, each syllable a betrayal that cut deeper than any insult from his business rivals. This wasn't just mockery. This was personal. He felt his knees weaken and he staggered back against the wall. The room, once a place of power, now felt like a prison. His thoughts scrambled, unable to find purchase. He had given Toby his trust, his loyalty. And now, to hear those words, cruel, mocking, dismissive, about Mary, about the woman he loved, felt like a betrayal that shattered everything Michael thought he knew about friendship. For days, he couldn't escape the sting of Toby's words. He replayed them over and over in his mind, wondering if everything had been a lie. Had Toby never truly supported him? Had his success always been just a means to an end for his friend, who now saw Mary as a threat to his status? Unable to hold back any longer, Michael confronted Toby in person. The confrontation was heated, raw. His anger, a fury he had never felt before, boiled to the surface as he demanded answers. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Michael's voice trembled with hurt and disbelief. How could you say that about her? About me? I thought you were my friend, Toby. Toby, never one to back down, looked at him with cold eyes. You're making a mistake, Michael. It's not what people like us do. You think you're some kind of savior, don't you? Playing the hero, trying to save a poor woman from the streets. But you're stupid. And you're ruining everything. I'm telling you this because I care. You've lost your mind. The words were like daggers, each one sinking deeper into Michael's heart. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. It was in the judgment, the disdain Toby had shown for Mary. The woman who had changed Michael's world, the one who had shown him what real strength looked like. Toby didn't see her as a person. He didn't see her as someone worthy of love. All he saw was a poor, pregnant woman who threatened the life Michael had worked so hard to build. I know what they've said about me, he began, his gaze steady and unwavering. They've called me a fool. They've mocked me for loving her. But they don't understand. They don't understand what it means to truly see someone, to see them for who they are, not for what the world has labeled them. Mary is not a beggar. She is not a threat. She is a woman who has fought to survive, who has shown me strength in ways I never imagined. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This isn't about money. This isn't about status. This is about integrity. It's about doing what's right, even when the world tells you it's wrong. His voice softened, but there was a power in it, a quiet dignity that made everyone listen. I chose to love her because she is worthy of love. And I will not let anyone tell me otherwise. As he finished speaking, Michael looked out over the room, meeting the eyes of those who had once looked down on him, those who had dismissed him as weak and naive. In that moment, he knew he had already won. This wasn't about the judgment of others. It was about him proving to himself, and to Mary, that he could stand up for what was right. The judge, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, leaned forward. I have heard enough, she said, her voice strong and measured. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements, but I am confident in my decision. Michael Turner has demonstrated not only that he is in control of his business, but that he has the courage to do what others fear. This case is dismissed. A wave of relief swept through Michael, but it wasn't just relief, it was a quiet, cathartic victory. He had faced the world's mockery, its disdain, and he had risen above it not with power, but with something stronger, his truth. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As he left the courtroom, walking side by side with Mary, the press and the spectators fell silent, unsure of how to respond to a victory that was not defined by wealth or status. It was a victory defined by dignity, by love, and by the quiet strength of a man who had chosen to do what was right. The dawn had come, not in the form of a bright sun, but in the form of a man who had found peace within himself. Michael knew that this was only the beginning. The world would continue to judge, to mock, to try and pull him back into the confines of their expectations. But he had learned something that could never be taken from him, that he could rise from nothing, stand tall, and be proud of the man he had become. And with Mary by his side, the world would have to accept that. The aftermath of the trial was quieter than Michael had imagined. The courtroom drama, the fierce battle of words and strategies, was over, but the world outside was still buzzing with the echoes of his victory. The press, hungry for sensational stories, labeled his win a fluke, dismissing it as the result of a lucky break rather than recognizing the strength of character that had fueled his fight. They failed to see the deeper truths, the resilience, the quiet courage it had taken for Michael to stand against everything he had once known. But Michael knew the truth. His victory was not just a legal one. It was a personal victory, one that had reclaimed his dignity, his values, and, most importantly, his heart. It wasn't about the courtroom, the media, or the press conferences. It was about Mary. It was about the life they were now building together, beyond the judgment of the world. Mary stood beside him, their hands intertwined, fingers laced together as if they had always been meant to hold one another. She was there, in the stillness of the moment, her quiet strength radiating through the space between them. The world might have written them off, called it a fluke, but Michael knew better. What he had with Mary was real. It was everything he had been searching for, even when he hadn't known what to look for. As they stepped out of the courthouse, cameras flashed around them, but Michael no longer cared about the lenses that sought to capture his every move. He wasn't the man they had once known, the man who had played by their rules, seeking approval from those who would never understand him. The public might have seen only the riches, the surface of his life. But he saw more. He saw Mary, standing beside him, her eyes filled with a kind of understanding that no one else could give him. In her, he saw the truth, her love, her grace, and her unwavering belief in him. For the first time in his life, he felt complete. His competitors, those who had once ridiculed him, those who had sneered at his choices, now stood broken and defeated. Their empire had crumbled, not by Michael's hand, but by their own greed, their own cruelty, and their inability to understand the deeper currents of life. They had everything, wealth, power, influence, but they had nothing of real value. No love, no compassion, no connection to the things that truly mattered. They had lived in a world where success was measured by what you had, not who you were. But Michael had won in a way that they never could have understood. His victory wasn't just a blow to their egos. It was a reminder of what they had lost: their humanity, their ability to connect with others, their capacity for love and respect. They might have still held their wealth, but in the quiet moments when the world wasn't watching, they would feel the emptiness of it all. The moral poverty that came with their success would haunt them, just as it had once haunted Michael, before he had found Mary. As the days passed, Michael began to notice subtle shifts. The people who had once distanced themselves from him began to look at him differently. They saw the strength in him, the quiet dignity that he had carried through the worst of the storm. They saw someone who had faced immense pressure and emerged unbroken, someone who had chosen love over all the things the world told him were important. But it wasn't the world's approval that mattered anymore. What mattered was the quiet peace he felt when he was with Mary. When he looked at her, his heart healed in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the weight of his past mistakes or his past fears that had lifted. It was the realization that love, real, unconditional love, was worth far more than anything else. He didn't need their validation. He didn't need their approval. He only needed to walk this life beside her. They didn't speak much about the future. The world had already told them what they couldn't have, what they couldn't be. But in the spaces between their words, in the moments of quiet understanding, Michael knew that everything was finally right. The world would never be kind to them, never fully accept them. But that no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet victories, the ones they shared, together, in the spaces where no one else could reach them. Mary squeezed his hand, her smile soft and warm, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a peace he had never known. In the chaos of the world, in the noise of the opinions and judgments that had once defined him, he had found something that transcended it all. A love that didn't need the world's approval. A love that didn't need anything other than their shared belief in each other. And that, Michael realized, was all he would ever need. As they walked into their new life, side by side, the world could say whatever it wanted. They had already won. The air was cool as Michael and Mary stood at the edge of the cemetery, their hands intertwined. The sun was beginning its slow descent beneath the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the sound of the city's hum fading into the distance as they stood in the quiet of the moment. Michael's eyes were fixed on the simple grave before them, the grave of his mother, Ruth. Her headstone was weathered, worn down by time, but it still held the faintest traces of her name. The years had not been kind to the markers of those who had passed, but for Michael, it was the words on the stone and the memory in his heart that mattered more than anything. His mother had been his guiding light, the one person who had believed in him when he had nothing, the one person who had shaped him into the man he had become. Mary, standing quietly by his side, didn't speak. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared moment of remembrance for the woman who had given Michael everything, even if it had only been her love and belief in him. It wasn't just Ruth's death that had shaped Michael's path, it was the way she had loved him unconditionally, with a strength that had pushed him to dream beyond what he thought was possible. Michael turned to Mary, his voice soft. "I've never brought anyone here before. My mother never got to meet you, but she would have loved you. Mary smiled gently, her eyes bright with an emotion Michael couldn't fully name. She nodded, squeezing his hand in understanding. I know, she said quietly. I know she would have. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that only two people who truly understood each other could share. A moment of peace, of connection, of shared history. And then, Mary reached into the pocket of her jacket, pulling out a small, frayed piece of cloth. It was simple, nothing more than a worn-out handkerchief, but it was enough. She handed it to Michael, her fingers brushing against his as she did. It's not much, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. But I thought, it could be a small piece of something to remember her by. Michael looked down at the cloth, his eyes lingering on the delicate, faded fabric. It had been well worn, the edges soft and tattered with time, but there was something in the gesture that moved him. It wasn't the cloth itself that held meaning, it was the thought behind it. The simple, beautiful kindness of a woman who had shared his struggles, his pain, and now his healing. He folded the cloth carefully in his hands, feeling its weight, its softness. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a symbol of the journey they had both been on. A journey filled with hardship, but also with growth, with love, with the quiet victories that had shaped their lives. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. As the light dipped below the horizon, Michael felt something shift within him. The weight of the past, the pain of his losses, the struggle against the world's expectations, they didn't disappear, but they no longer defined him. The road ahead was uncertain, full of twists and turns, but Michael realized that, for the first time, he didn't need to walk it alone. He looked at Mary, her face bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, and felt a peace settle in his chest. She was his anchor now. With her by his side, he no longer feared the unknown. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his own. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they turned away from the grave, walking side by side, their steps in sync as they left the cemetery behind. Michael knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and struggles yet to come. But as the last rays of sunlight kissed the earth and the world grew quiet around them, Michael understood that he no longer had to face it alone. With Mary beside him, the journey was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace, something to share. And as the night descended, the first stars beginning to appear in the sky, Michael felt a deep, abiding peace in his heart. For the first time in his life, he knew that everything was finally right.